Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at O wie selig, seid, doch, Frommen, which translates to, "Oh, how happy you are, you pious ones." All in all, relatively straightforward chorale. We're looking at the same text as we looked at in the last episode, but the melody is different. But it's actually kind of interesting because there are harmonic similarities between both of the settings of the text. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So we have one flat in the key signature, we start on D minor, and we end on D major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is D minor. It's kind of interesting how Bach blurs the line between D minor and F major with the idea of like A minor occurring even though we're in the key of D minor here. So we start off with our tonic triad, passing tones in the alto and the bass before we get F, D, A, and A, which is just taking our D minor chord and putting it in first inversion. Another passing tone in the bass, and then we get A, C natural, E, and C natural. Very interesting to see the subtonic doubled in this chord. Typically, when we see a 5 chord, the reason why it's minor has to do with the note in the melody, but the fact that it's being doubled and like reinforced by the tenor here is really interesting. But yes, we do have a minor dominant here. Minor dominants are generally on the rarer side, but we see one here, and yeah, it's interesting because there's sort of like a fluidity between D minor and F major happening here. We have passing tones in the lower voices here, which does actually give us a chord that I might analyze here. This would be C7 over G, which would be like a 7-4-3 chord, a subtonic seventh. So maybe that would be a potential substitute or another take on what this minor 5 chord could be, depending on what you look at. But I'll include it there just because it's interesting that the chord does morph from one to the other. And then we get F, A, F, and D, which is just our D minor chord again in first inversion. We have passing tones in 3 of the voices, both of the upper voices and the bass, and we have like a thirdless chord here, which makes it kind of hard to analyze or know what the quality would be, so we'll just leave it out. And then we have D, D, A, and F, which is just taking our D minor chord, putting it in root position again, kind of like the retrograde or the inverse of what's happening at the beginning of the chorale. And that takes us to A, D, A, and E, which is A minor again. This D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and typically 4-3 suspensions happen over dominant triads, so I think there's something about this particular melody or this particular text where Bach is evoking that minor dominant sound. Yeah, I think it just has to do with his relationship with the text or maybe other settings of this chorale that he was familiar with. But we do have a sort of passing seventh here, a delayed passing seventh of the alto, and we start moving towards the key of F major to prepare us for our cadence. We have B flat, C, F, and D. There's a 9/8 suspension over a 6 chord here. That's kind of interesting. B flat major, which I do think is our portal to the key of F major where it becomes our 4 chord. And that takes us to our tonic F major. F, A, this B flat's a 4-3 suspension here, F, and C, which is actually really interesting here because this sort of combats the general trend that I've been discussing in my videos, which is it's very typical to see 9/8 suspensions over tonic triads in root position, and very common for us to see 4-3 suspensions over dominant triads in root position. However, we have a flip here. In the key of F major, we have B flat, which is our 4 chord, with a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and we have F, which is our tonic, with a 4-3 suspension over the bass. But interestingly so, if we looked at this in terms of B flat terms, which I don't think we're in the key of B flat here, I think we're in the key of F. If B flat were our tonic, it would be a 9/8 suspension, and if B flat were our tonic, F would be our dominant, which would have a 4-3 suspension. So maybe the B flat and the F relationship here is one of tonic and dominant nature, just because of the way that suspensions typically operate in Bach's chorale writing, but that's largely speculative. I just think it's interesting that you could interpret it multiple ways here based on how the suspensions end up working out. But regardless, we have G, A, D, and B flat. This A is like a 2-1 suspension, 9/8 suspension, something like that over the bass. But we know that like a G minor chord is being implied here, which is our 2-chord in root position. D is a chord tone, B flat is a chord tone, and G is the resolution to our suspension. We then go to C, F, C, and B flat. Again, sort of like a 4/3 suspension, or like an accented non-chord tone that is a fourth above the bass that resolves down to the third. But a 5/7 chord is what's being implied here. C7 without the fifth. And then our imperfect authentic cadence concludes with a tonic triad. F, F, C, and A. F major. Next phrase stays in the key of F major, and we end with a perfect authentic cadence this time. We start off with F major over A, C, F, and F, which is taking our tonic triad and inverting it. And on the next beat, F and A, those are just taking our chord and putting it in root position, so we'll mark that. We then have B flat, D, F, and D, which is our 4 chord, and B flat and D are both chord tones, so we don't have to mark them. That takes us to E, G, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion, 5/6, and we're seeing a pattern here. If you haven't already identified it already, it's like 2 of the voices are being paired up to revoice the chord on the end of the beat by this third space motion. We have C, G, E, and C, which is just taking our 5 chord and putting it in root position, and that takes us to F, 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 C, and A, which is our tonic triad. This is the first time we see the voices not being used to respell the chord, but rather just pass to the next beat, which is where we get F major again. F, A, F, and C. No need to reanalyze, but the chord does briefly go to first inversion here on the end of the beat, so we'll mark that there. We then get B flat, G, E, and C. This is kind of interesting. We've seen this in the past before, so if we take it literally on the downbeat, this would be a 5/4-2 chord. However, I think this B flat is sort of operating as an accented non-chord tone. It's sort of like a reverse suspension almost, where we have the B flat under the C and the C under the, resolving the C under the C. It's almost like a lower 9/8 suspension almost. Which is kind of interesting because the 4/2 chord isn't really operating the way that we would expect Bach to use it. But it could be an irregular 4/2 suspension, or 4/2 resolution rather, who knows. But we've seen this pattern before where the 7th of the chord just steps upwards to the root of the chord, which makes me feel like it's acting more like a non-chord tone rather than as the base of the chord. But after our 5 chord, we get D, F, F, and A, which is our 6 chord in root position. C is a passing 7th. C is also like non-chord tone, but it's still the 7th. And then we get A here, which is a chord tone, so I will not mark that. So we have kind of an incomplete chord here. Maybe a 1's being implied, maybe a 3's being implied. There's no real way to know for sure because it's not entirely contextualized. But 6 takes us to B flat, D, G, and B flat, which is our 2 chord in first inversion. G minor. No 7th here. We do have a little passing 7th in the alto, but it's not quite part of the chord on the downbeat. We then get C, C, F, and G. That was hard for me to count there, but this F is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. It's very common to see 4/3 suspensions over dominant chords, as I've said. But this is our 5 chord, or at least it's our implied 5 chord. And this D is a little enclosure surrounding the resolution. G is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then C takes us to C again. C, C, E, and G with the passing 7th and the tenor, so we don't need to reanalyze. And then we cadence on F major. F, A, C, and F. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase takes us to the key of D minor. Ends in, I autopiloted there. Not a perfect authentic cadence, a deceptive cadence, which is pretty cool when these come up. We start off with F major, F, A, F, and F, C, F, and A, which is still our tonic triad. We don't need to reanalyze. That takes us to C, C, E, and G. This F is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and as we already know, very common over 5 chords. A little delayed passing 7th here in the tenor before we get D minor, D, A, E, and F. 9/8 suspensions are very common over tonic functioning triads, so this is our 6th chord. It also happens to be our tonic triad in the key of D minor, but Bach also does a lot of 9/8 suspensions just over D minor chords in general, and I don't know exactly why that's the case. Maybe it's just coincidental, like if he picked different keys it wouldn't be D minor, but I find that even when D is not operating as our tonic, we see 9/8 suspensions over D minor chords with a lot. And yeah, like I said, that could be coincidence, but it's just an interesting observation that I've made as I've been analyzing. But after our tonic triad, we get G, B flat, D, and E. It's E minor 7 flat 5 over G. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. C sharp is a non-chord tone. E is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And also B natural is not a chord tone. B flat is a chord tone, but B natural isn't. And they don't happen at the same time, so it's not technically a cross relation, but if you group the entire beat together, it's kind of interesting. We have A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord, typically where we expect 2/6 to go to, and we have a little passing 7th here in the tenor as well, before we cadence not on 1, but on B flat major 6, B flat, F, D, and D, which is what makes this a deceptive cadence. Not necessarily that it ends on 6, even though 6 is by far the most common deceptive cadence we would see. Sorry, I smacked my microphone there, but yeah, it's the fact that the dominant resolves to something other than the tonic that makes it deceptive, but 6 is like the quintessential deceptive cadence. Our last phrase does end in the key of D minor, but it ends in a perfect authentic cadence. However, I think we go to the key of F major in between this phrase and the end of the phrase. So I'm going to analyze this B flat chord as a 4 chord in the key of F major. I just think it's interesting that B flat was the chord that ended up being the gateway to F in the first phrase, and that it's serving as the gateway to the key of F in the last phrase. And of course you could have analyzed this really at any one of these chords, because there isn't anything chromatic going on in this phrase, which makes it kind of hard to know, because it's all just diatonic chords. But after our 4 chord, it takes us to F major, F, F, C, and A, which I likened what's happening here in the previous phrase. We have a passing tone here in the alto before we get E, G, E, and C, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, C major. And then we get D minor, D, A, F, and D, which is our 6 chord. Passing tones in the bass and the alto. Then we get F, D, A, and A, which is just taking our D minor chord, re-inverting it, or I guess not really re-inverting it, introducing it in first inversion, but on the end of the beat it does get re-inverted, similar to what's happening here in the second phrase. We have D and F, which takes the chord and briefly puts it back in root position. And then we get E, C, G, and C, which is just taking our 5 chord, introducing it in first inversion before, just like the previous beat, putting it in first inversion, root position, C, C, E, and C. Actually, you know what, even though that is the case, it's not a complete chord, because the 5th is being replaced by a 3rd, and even though we know that the chord is being put in root position here, because it's not entirely intact, I'm not going to analyze it on the offbeat, and that's just something stylistically that I've done in my analysis. But if you analyze that as a 5 chord, as a root position 5 chord here, I think that'd be totally valid. But afterwards, it resolves to our tonic F, C, F, and A, which has a passing 7th here in the bass. And with the C sharp that we see on the next beat, I do think we're moving to the key of D minor, and we're going to be moving through our 3 chord here, which is kind of interesting to have 3 be the pivot between the 2 keys. It's not necessarily the strongest chord in the minor context, or the minor key, contextually speaking, but it's it happens with quite a bit of frequency actually. So afterwards we have D here, which is functioning as an accented non-chord tone. It's really C sharp, B flat, E, and G, which is 7 fully diminished seventh. And then we would expect that to take us to our tonic D minor, D, A, D, and F, which it does. And on the end of the beat we get B flat, D, and F, which is pretty cool. It turns it into a 6 chord. Briefly, B flat major. That takes us to G, B flat, D, and E. E minor 7 flat 5 over G, which is our 2 chord in first inversion. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. That takes us to A major, A, E, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord. A major. A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. G's the little passing tone here, or passing seventh, before we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic in root position with the Picardy third. Bach often ends his minor chorales with the Picardy third. And that's today's analysis. Really, I think the only big takeaway from today's chorale is mid-phrase modulation that goes on here in the last phrase, just because he modulates to F and then goes back to D minor. It's much more common for Bach to pick a key to modulate to and then end the phrase with it, rather than start in a key and then modulate to another one. But other than that, the minor dominants are probably the big takeaway from this chorale. It's pretty rare to see minor dominants in Bach's writing, but we do see them from time to time, and it's always interesting when they pop up. But other than that, this chorale is pretty straightforward, and I think I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.